The rain hammered against the windshield of the old pickup truck as Maya gripped the steering wheel tighter. Her knuckles were white from the pressure, matching the color of her face as she struggled to see through the storm. In the passenger seat, her brother Jake checked his phone for the 100th time, hoping for a message from their potential employer. Behind them, their triplet sister Zoe stared out the window, watching the lightning illuminate the dark Seattle night. "We should have stayed home," Zoe muttered, her breath fogging up the glass. "This storm is getting worse by the minute." Maya glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "We can't afford to stay home. This catering job could pay our rent for 3 months. Mom's medical bills aren't going to pay themselves." The 3 siblings had been struggling ever since their mother was diagnosed with cancer 6 months ago. At 25, they had already faced more hardship than most people experience in a lifetime. Their father had left when they were just 2 years old, and their mother had worked 3 jobs to raise them alone. Now that she was sick, it was their turn to take care of her. Jake folded his phone and looked ahead. "The bridge is coming up. GPS says we're almost there." The Aurora Bridge stretched before them, its steel cables barely visible in the heavy rain. Maya slowed down as they approached, the truck's old engine struggling against the wind. Traffic was light due to the storm, with most sensible people staying indoors. As they reached the middle of the bridge, Maya noticed something strange. A figure stood near the edge, barely visible through the rain and darkness. The person appeared to be leaning over the railing, and something about their posture made Maya's heart race. "Stop the truck," Jake said suddenly, having noticed the same thing. "What?" "Why?" Maya asked, but she was already pulling over to the narrow emergency lane. "Someone's on the bridge," Zoe said, pressing her face against the window. "They're not just standing there. Something's wrong." The 3 siblings exchanged worried looks. They had all seen enough tragedy in their lives to recognize when someone was in real trouble. Without speaking, they all knew what they had to do. Maya turned on the hazard lights and they climbed out of the truck, immediately getting soaked by the freezing rain. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked Zoe off her feet, but Jake caught her arm and steadied her. Together they walked toward the figure on the bridge. As they got closer, they could see it was a man in an expensive suit, now completely ruined by the rain. He was tall and thin, probably in his 50s, with graying hair plastered to his head. He stood with his hands on the railing, looking down at the dark water below. His whole body was shaking, though whether from cold or emotion, they couldn't tell. "Sir?" Maya called out, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Are you okay?" The man turned toward them, and in the flash of lightning they could see his face clearly for the first time. His eyes were red and swollen, tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. He looked surprised to see them, as if he had forgotten that other people existed in the world. "Please," he said, his voice cracking, "just leave me alone. I don't want anyone else to get hurt because of me." Jake stepped forward, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture. "We're not going anywhere, sir. Whatever's happening, we can talk about it." The man laughed bitterly. "Talk about it? You wanna talk about how I've destroyed everything I've ever touched? How I've hurt everyone who ever mattered to me?" Zoe moved to stand beside her brothers, forming a semicircle around the desperate man. "We don't know what you're going through, but ending things here won't fix anything. It'll just create more pain." "More pain?" The man's voice rose above the wind. "I've already caused enough pain to last several lifetimes. My business is ruined. My reputation is destroyed. Everyone I care about hates me, and they have every right to." Maya took a careful step closer. "What's your name?" The man hesitated, then seemed to decide it didn't matter anymore. "Richard. Richard Blackwood." Jake's eyes widened slightly. Even though they weren't interested in business news, everyone in Seattle knew that name. Richard Blackwood was one of the city's most successful entrepreneurs worth billions. His company, Blackwood Industries, employed thousands of people and had buildings throughout the city. "Mr. Blackwood," Maya said gently, "you're obviously going through something terrible right now. But whatever it is, there has to be another way to handle it." Richard shook his head violently. "You don't understand. I've lost everything that matters. My company is facing bankruptcy because of my mistakes. I've been lying to shareholders for months, trying to cover up bad investments. When the truth comes out tomorrow, thousands of people will lose their jobs because of me." The rain continued to pour down on all of them, but none of them seemed to notice anymore. The triplets were focused entirely on keeping this man from making a decision he couldn't take back. "So fix it," Zoe said simply. "If you made the mistakes, then you're the one who can fix them." Richard stared at her through the rain. "You're just kids. You couldn't possibly understand the kind of pressure I'm under, the weight of responsibility for so many lives." "We understand more than you think," Jake replied. "We've been responsible for our sick mother since we were teenagers. We know what it feels like to have people depending on you." "But I've failed them," Richard whispered. "I've failed everyone." Maya moved even closer, now close enough to reach out and touch his arm if she wanted to. "Then don't fail them again by giving up. Stay and fight. Stay and find a way to make it right." For a long moment, the only sound was the storm raging around them. Richard stood frozen at the railing, staring down at the water, while three strangers tried to pull him back from the edge of despair. Finally, he turned to look at them again. In his eyes, they could see a flicker of something that might have been hope, or perhaps just exhaustion. "Why do you care?" he asked. "You don't even know me." "Because every life matters," Maya said firmly. "And because we believe that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define who you are forever." Richard's grip on the railing loosened slightly, and Jake saw his opportunity. He stepped forward and gently placed his hand over Richard's. "Come on," Jake said softly. "Let's get out of this rain and figure this out together." Richard allowed Jake to guide him away from the railing, his legs unsteady as they walked toward the pickup truck. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and all four of them were soaked to the bone. Maya opened the passenger door and helped Richard climb inside while Jake and Zoe squeezed into the back seat. Inside the truck, the silence was deafening except for the sound of rain hitting the roof. Richard sat with his head in his hands, shivering uncontrollably. Maya started the engine and turned the heat up as high as it would go, though the old truck's heater barely made a difference. "Where can we take you?" Maya asked gently. "Do you have somewhere safe to go?" Richard lifted his head and stared out the windshield. "I have a penthouse downtown, but I can't face going there. Too many memories. Too many reminders of everything I've lost." Zoe leaned forward from the back seat. "What about family? Is there someone who could be with you tonight?" A bitter laugh escaped Richard's lips. "Family? I destroyed that a long time ago. I was so focused on building my empire that I forgot what really mattered. My wife divorced me 5 years ago. My children." He trailed off, his voice breaking again. "Your children what?" Jake asked softly. "They don't speak to me anymore. I was never there for them when they were growing up. Always traveling, always working, always chasing the next big deal. By the time I realized what I had lost, it was too late." Maya pulled out of the emergency lane and began driving slowly through the storm. It's never too late to reconnect with family. Maybe this crisis is an opportunity to reach out to them. Richard shook his head. "You don't understand. My oldest daughter told me 2 years ago that she wished I was dead. She said her life would have been better if I had never been born. How do you come back from that?" The pain in his voice was so raw that all three siblings felt it in their chests. They exchanged glances in the rearview mirror, each thinking about their own absent father and how much they had struggled without him. "What about your other children?" Zoe asked carefully. I have 3 others, but I lost touch with them even earlier. Their mother and I. Richard stopped and took a shaky breath. I made a terrible mistake 23 years ago. I was young and scared, and I ran away from my responsibilities. I convinced myself they were better off without me, but the truth is I was just a coward. Jake felt something twist in his stomach. 23 years ago would have been right around the time he and his sisters were born. But there were probably thousands of children born in Seattle that year. It had to be a coincidence. "Where are we going?" Richard asked, noticing that Maya was driving through unfamiliar neighborhoods. "Our apartment," Maya replied. "You can dry off and have some coffee while you decide what to do next. Our mom's asleep, so we'll be quiet." Richard started to protest. "I can't impose on strangers like this. You've already done more than enough." "You're not imposing," Zoe said firmly. "And we're not strangers anymore. We're the people who pulled you back from that bridge, which makes us connected whether you like it or not." Despite everything, Richard found himself almost smiling at that. These 3 young people had appeared out of nowhere and saved his life. And now they were taking care of him like he was family. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had shown him such kindness without expecting something in return. Maya parked in front of a run-down apartment building in one of Seattle's less fashionable neighborhoods. The paint was peeling, and several windows were boarded up, but it was home. They helped Richard out of the truck and hurried through the rain to the front entrance. The apartment was small but clean, with mismatched furniture and family photos covering every surface. Richard found himself studying the pictures as the siblings bustled around, getting towels and starting coffee. Most of the photos showed the 3 of them at various ages, always together, always smiling despite their circumstances. "Here," Maya said, handing him a warm towel and a mug of coffee. "This should help warm you up." Richard wrapped the towel around his shoulders and took a grateful sip of the coffee. It was stronger than what he usually drank, but it felt good going down. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you for what you've done tonight." "You don't need to repay us," Jake said, settling into a worn armchair across from the couch where Richard sat. "Just promise us you won't try anything like that again." Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "I can't make that promise yet. Tomorrow morning, the news is going to break about my company's financial problems. By noon, I'll probably be facing criminal charges for fraud. Everything I spent my life building will be gone." "So you'll build something new," Zoe said simply. "People do it all the time. At my age, with my reputation destroyed, who would trust me with anything ever again?" Maya sat down on the edge of the coffee table, facing Richard directly. "Look around this room. Do you see any expensive furniture? Any signs of wealth?" Richard glanced around and shook his head. "We grew up poor," Maya continued. "Our father left when we were 2 years old, and our mom worked herself nearly to death trying to provide for us. We've been taking care of ourselves since we were teenagers, and now we're taking care of her while she fights cancer. We've failed at things too," Jake added. "Maya lost her scholarship to nursing school because she had to work too many hours to pay bills. I dropped out of community college 3 times. Zoe had to give up her dreams of being a teacher because we needed the money from her job at the factory. But we're still here," Zoe said. "We're still fighting. We still believe that tomorrow might be better than today." Richard looked at each of them in turn, seeing something in their eyes that he had lost long ago. Hope. Resilience. The kind of strength that comes from surviving real hardship and choosing to keep going anyway. "How old are you 3? He asked. Suddenly, 25, Maya replied. "We're triplets, born on March 15th. Richard's coffee mug slipped from his hands, crashing to the floor and sending hot liquid everywhere. His face had gone completely white, and he was staring at Maya as if he had seen a ghost. "March 15th, he whispered. 25 years ago?" The siblings looked at each other in confusion. "Yes," Jake said slowly. Why? What's wrong? Richard's hands were shaking as he reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed a young woman with long brown hair and kind eyes, holding 3 tiny babies. The woman looked exactly like an older version of Maya, and the babies— "Oh my God!" Zoe breathed, recognizing the resemblance immediately. Richard's voice was barely audible as he spoke. "Your mother! What's her name?" Maya felt like the world was spinning around her. Sarah Chen. Richard closed his eyes and let out a sound that was part sob, part laugh. "I've been looking for you for 23 years. The silence in the small apartment stretched on for what felt like hours. The 3 siblings stared at Richard in complete shock, while he sat on their couch holding a 25-year-old photograph of their mother and themselves as newborns. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but none of them wanted to believe what they were seeing. "That's impossible," Jake finally whispered. "Our father died in a car accident when we were babies. Mom told us." Richard looked up at him with tears streaming down his face. "She told you I was dead?" "I suppose in her mind, I was. When I found out she was pregnant with triplets, I panicked. I was only 27, just starting my first business, drowning in debt and stress. I convinced myself that 3 babies would ruin both of our lives." Maya stood up abruptly, backing away from the couch. "No, this isn't real. This is some kind of sick coincidence." "I left one night without saying goodbye," Richard continued, his voice thick with regret. "I wrote her a letter saying I couldn't handle the responsibility, that she and the babies would be better off without me. I was a coward, and I've regretted it every single day since." Zoe grabbed the photograph from Richard's hands and studied it closely. There was no denying the resemblance between the woman in the picture and their mother, though Sarah looked much younger and happier than they had ever seen her. The babies in the photo were clearly premature, lying in incubators, just as their mother had always told them about their difficult birth. "Where did you get this picture?" Zoe demanded. "Your mother sent it to me about a month after you were born, along with a letter telling me that you had all survived the complications and that I would never see any of you again. She said she was moving away and changing her name, and that if I ever tried to find her, she would disappear completely." Jake ran his hands through his wet hair, trying to process what he was hearing. "So you just gave up? You never tried to find us?" "I tried," Richard said desperately. "I hired private investigators for years. I searched every database, every record I could access. But your mother was smart. She changed her last name from Rodriguez to Chen when she married her second husband when you were 5. She moved you to different schools, different neighborhoods. It was like you had vanished from the earth." Maya felt like she was going to be sick. Her second husband? Mom was never married to anyone else. She's always been Chen. Richard shook his head. She married a man named David Chen when you were 5 years old. He adopted all 3 of you, which is why your last name changed. But the marriage only lasted 2 years. After the divorce, she kept his name to make it harder for me to track you down." The siblings exchanged shocked glances. Their mother had never mentioned being married to anyone. They had always assumed Chen was her maiden name. How many other lies had she told them over the years? "You're lying," Maya said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Mom wouldn't lie to us about something this important." "Wouldn't she?" Richard asked gently. "Think about it. A single mother with 3 children, no money, no support system. I had left her with nothing but debt and broken promises. From her perspective, telling you I was dead was probably the kindest thing she could do." Zoe sank into a chair, still clutching the photograph. "This is why she never wanted to talk about our father. Whenever we asked questions, she would get upset and change the subject." "I kept looking for you," Richard continued. "Even as my business grew and I became successful, I never stopped hoping I would find you someday. I wanted to make things right, To be the father I should have been from the beginning. Jake laughed bitterly. 23 years too late for that, don't you think? We grew up poor because of you. Mom worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. We wore second-hand clothes and never had birthday parties because she couldn't afford them. You think I don't know that? Richard's voice cracked. You think I don't lie awake every night thinking about what your lives must have been like? I've donated millions to charities that help single mothers. But I knew it could never make up for what I did to your family. Maya walked to the window and stared out at the storm, which was finally beginning to weaken. So what? You expect us to just forgive you because you feel bad about it? You expect us to welcome you back into our lives with open arms? I don't expect anything, Richard said quietly. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve to be in your lives at all. But finding you tonight, having you save me when I was about to give up on everything, it feels like some kind of miracle. A miracle? Zoe stood up, anger flashing in her eyes. You call this a miracle? Our mother is dying of cancer and we can't afford the treatment that might save her. We're about to lose our apartment because we can't pay rent. Maya gave up her dreams to take care of us, Jake can't finish school, and I'm working in a factory that's slowly killing my lungs. Where was your miracle then? Richard's face went pale. Sarah is sick? Stage 3 cancer, Jake said flatly. The doctors say she might have a year left if she's lucky. But the treatments are expensive, and our insurance barely covers anything. I can help, Richard said immediately. I can pay for the best doctors, the best treatment facilities. Money isn't an issue. Money isn't an issue. Maya turned from the window, her eyes blazing. Money has been the only issue our entire lives. We've sacrificed everything for money, and now you show up offering to throw some at us like that fixes 23 years of abandonment? I'm not trying to fix anything, Richard said desperately. I'm trying to help the only way I know how. I can't change the past, but maybe I can do something about the present. The front door to the apartment opened quietly, and all 4 of them turned to see Sarah Chen standing in the doorway. She was thin and pale from her treatments, wearing an old robe and slippers. Her eyes went immediately to Richard, and the color drained from her face. Hello, Sarah, Richard said softly. Sarah's legs seemed to give out beneath her, and she gripped the doorframe for support. It's not possible. You can't be here. The triplets rushed to their mother's side, helping her to the couch. She was shaking, uncontrollably, her eyes never leaving Richard's face. Mom, are you okay? Maya asked, though she knew it was a ridiculous question. Sarah looked at her children, then back at Richard. How did you find us? I didn't, Richard replied. They found me. They saved my life tonight, and I had no idea who they were until a few minutes ago. Sarah closed her eyes and took several deep breaths. When she opened them again, she looked directly at her children. I suppose it's time you knew the truth about everything. Sarah sat on the couch between Maya and Zoe, while Jake pulled up a chair to face both his mother and the man who was apparently his father. Richard remained standing, as if he didn't feel he had the right to sit in their family circle. 23 years, Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I always wondered if this day would come, but I hoped it never would. Mom, Maya said gently, you don't have to explain anything. We understand why you didn't want to tell us about him. Sarah shook her head. No, you don't understand. Not completely. And you deserve to know everything now that he's here. She looked at Richard, and for a moment, the years seemed to fall away. Despite everything that had happened between them, there was still a flicker of the love they had once shared. We were young and stupid, Sarah began. I was 22, working as a waitress and taking night classes. Richard was 27, trying to start his first business. We met at a coffee shop where I worked weekends. You were beautiful, Richard said softly. inside and out. You were kind to everyone, even the customers who treated you badly. You were working so hard to build a better life for yourself. Sarah smiled sadly. He was different then. Ambitious. Yes, but not ruthless. He actually cared about people. We fell in love fast, and when I got pregnant, we were both scared but excited. What changed? Zoe asked. The pregnancy was difficult from the start, Sarah continued. Triplets are always high risk, and I was in and out of the hospital for months. Richard's business was struggling too. He had borrowed money from some dangerous people, and they were pressuring him to pay it back. Richard stepped closer, his hands clenched at his sides. I was drowning. The medical bills were piling up, the business was failing, and these men were threatening to hurt Sarah if I didn't pay them back. I felt like I was destroying everything I touched. So you ran, Jake said, his voice cold. So I ran, Richard admitted. I convinced myself that if I disappeared, Sarah could claim to be a single mother and get government assistance. I thought she could move back in with her parents and start over without the baggage of my failures. Sarah laughed bitterly. Except, my parents had disowned me when they found out I was pregnant. They were very traditional, and having babies out of wedlock was shameful to them. I had nowhere to go. I didn't know that, Richard said, pain evident in his voice. You never told me your parents had cut you off. There's a lot we never told each other, Sarah replied. We were too young to handle something that big. After you left, I had to figure out how to survive on my own with 3 premature babies. Maya reached for her mother's hand. How did you do it? How did you manage without any help? There was a social worker at the hospital named Mrs. Patterson. She helped me apply for every assistance program available. I lived in a shelter for the first 6 months, then got into subsidized housing. The 3 of you were so small and fragile, but you fought to live every single day. And David Chen? Zoe asked. Tell us about him. Sarah's expression softened, slightly. David was a good man. He was a nurse at the clinic where I took you for checkups. He saw how hard I was struggling and he offered to help. We got married when you were 5, mostly so you could have health insurance through his job. But you divorced him, Jake observed. David wanted children of his own, Sarah explained. He loved you 3, but he also wanted to experience being a father from the beginning. I was so exhausted from raising you alone that I couldn't imagine having another baby. We tried to make it work, but eventually we realized we wanted different things. Richard had been listening to all of this with increasing anguish on his face. I caused all of that suffering. If I had stayed and faced my problems instead of running away, none of you would have had to go through any of it. Maybe, Sarah said. Or maybe we would have all ended up homeless when your creditors came after everything we owned. We'll never know what might have been different. I tried to find you, Richard said again. After my business finally succeeded, I hired the best private investigators money could buy. But you had covered your tracks too well. Sarah nodded. I made sure of that. I was terrified that you would show up someday and try to take the children away from me. By then, they were my whole world. I couldn't risk losing them. I would never have tried to take them from you, Richard protested. Wouldn't you? You were becoming rich and powerful. I was a single mother working minimum wage jobs. If you had wanted custody, you could have afforded better lawyers than I ever could. The room fell silent as everyone contemplated how different their lives might have been. The triplets had grown up believing their father was dead, while their actual father had spent decades searching for them and building a fortune he couldn't enjoy because of his guilt. There's something else you need to know, Sarah said, looking directly at Richard. About 6 years ago, I was diagnosed with a rare genetic condition that makes certain cancers more likely. The doctor said it was probably hereditary. Richard's face went white. Hereditary? You mean the children might? They've all been tested, Sarah said quickly. None of them carry the gene, they're safe. But the doctors think the stress of raising 3 children alone, working multiple jobs, never Having adequate health care? All of that may have triggered the condition earlier than it would have occurred naturally. The implication hung in the air like a physical weight. If Richard hadn't abandoned them, if Sarah had had support and better health care, she might not. Be dying now. I'm going to be sick, Richard said, rushing toward the bathroom. They could hear him retching, and Maya started to get up to check on him, but Sarah stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. Let him process this, Sarah said. He's learning that his choices didn't just affect him. They rippled out and changed all of our lives in ways he never imagined. Do you hate him? Zoe asked her mother. Sarah was quiet for a long time before answering. I used to. For the first few years, I hated him so much it felt like poison in my veins. But hate is exhausting, and I needed all my energy to take care of you three. Eventually, I just let it go. I focused on building a life for us and tried not to think about what we had lost. And now? Jake asked. How do you feel seeing him? Again? Sad, Sarah said simply. Sad for all of us. Sad for the life we might have had together. Sad that it took a crisis to bring him back into our lives. Sad that I'm running out of time to figure out what any of this means. Richard returned from the bathroom, his face pale but composed. I'm sorry. I needed a moment. We all need more than a moment, Maya said. This is a lot to process. I know you have no reason to trust me, Richard said, looking at each of them in turn. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but please let me help with your mother's medical bills. Let me try to give her the best possible chance to beat this. We can't just take your money, Jake said. That doesn't make us a family. I'm not trying to buy my way into your lives, Richard replied. I'm trying to take responsibility for the consequences of my actions. If my leaving contributed to Sarah's illness, then helping her get well is the least I can do. Sarah studied Richard's face for a long moment, seeing both the young man she had fallen in love with and the stranger he had become. There are conditions, she said finally. Richard leaned forward, desperate hope flickering in his eyes. Anything. Name your conditions. Sarah took a deep breath, clearly having thought about this possibility many times over the years, even if she never expected it to actually happen. First, you don't get to waltz back into our lives and pretend the past 23 years didn't happen. If you want to be part of this family, you start at the bottom and earn your place. I understand, Richard said immediately. Second, the children get to decide individually how much contact they want with you. You don't pressure them, you don't guilt them, and you respect their boundaries completely. If one of them wants a relationship and the others don't, you accept that. Maya, Jake, and Zoe exchanged glances. Their mother was protecting them even now, making sure they wouldn't be forced into anything they weren't ready for. Third, Sarah continued, you deal with your own problems. You said earlier that your company is facing bankruptcy and you might face criminal charges. You can't use helping us as an excuse to ignore your responsibilities to the thousands of people who work for you. Richard's expression darkened. The company is finished, Sarah. Tomorrow morning, the news will break about our financial irregularities. By the end of the week, we'll be in bankruptcy court. What kind of financial irregularities? Jake asked. I made some very bad investments 2 years ago, Richard admitted. Tech startups that looked promising but turned out to be basically scams. Instead of admitting the losses to our shareholders and board of directors, I used money from our pension fund to cover them up, thinking I could make it back with other investments. You stole from your employees' retirement money? Zoe asked, horrified. I borrowed it, Richard corrected, then immediately shook his head. No, that's not fair. I stole it. I told myself I was borrowing it, but I stole it, and now I can't pay it back. Maya stood up and began pacing around the small living room. How much money are we talking about? $47 million, Richard said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. None of the siblings could even conceptualize that amount of money. It was more than they would earn in several lifetimes. You stole $47 million from people who trusted you, and then you were going to kill yourself rather than face the consequences? Jake's voice was filled with disgust. I know how it sounds, Richard said defensively. But you have to understand the pressure I was under. The board was asking questions, the SEC was starting an investigation, and I knew that when the truth came out, not only would I go to prison, but thousands of innocent employees would lose their jobs and their retirement savings because of my mistakes. So instead of trying to fix it, you decided to jump off a bridge? Maya stopped pacing and stared at him. Do you realize how selfish that is? Your death wouldn't have magically restored the pension fund. It would have just left everyone else to clean up your mess while you escaped all responsibility. Richard flinched as if she had slapped him. You're right. I wasn't thinking clearly. The shame and guilt were so overwhelming that I couldn't see any way out. There's always a way out, Sarah said firmly. It might not be easy or comfortable, but there's always a way to make things right if you're willing to do the work. What do you suggest? Richard asked. I've already mortgaged everything I own trying to cover the losses. My personal assets might be worth $12 or $13 million, but that still leaves over $30 million unaccounted for. Zoe had been quiet through most of this conversation, but now she spoke up. What about the other companies you invested in? The ones that weren't scams? Most of them failed too, Richard said, but there are a few that are still operating. They might be worth something eventually, but right now they're not generating enough revenue to matter. Eventually isn't good. Enough, Jake said. You need to find a way to pay back that money now, before more people get hurt. Richard ran his hands through his hair, which had finally dried from the rain. I've been racking my brain for months trying to figure out how to fix this. I've consulted with lawyers, accountants, financial advisors. Everyone tells me the same thing. There's no way to recover that much money quickly enough to prevent the bankruptcy. Maybe you're approaching this wrong, Maya said thoughtfully. Instead of trying to hide what happened or fix it in secret, what if you came clean publicly and asked for help? Asked for help from whom? Richard asked. From everyone, Maya replied. Your employees, your shareholders, your competitors, the public. What if you held a press conference and told the whole truth about what happened? What if you asked people to help you save the company and protect the jobs? Richard stared at her as if she had suggested he fly to the moon. That's financial suicide. No one would trust me again. No one would invest in anything I touched. They don't trust you now, Zoe pointed out. And tomorrow, when the news breaks, they're going to find out about the missing money anyway. At least if you tell them yourself, you control the narrative. But what would I ask them to do? Richard asked. I can't expect people to just donate money to cover my mistakes. Sarah had been listening to this conversation with growing interest. What if it wasn't about covering your mistakes? What if it was about saving the company and protecting the employees? I don't understand the difference. The difference is ownership, Sarah explained. What if you offered to give up your controlling stake in the company in exchange for an emergency investment fund? What if you turned Blackwood Industries into an employee-owned cooperative? Richard's eyes widened. Give up control of my own company? It's not really your company anymore anyway, Jake said bluntly. You've already proven you can't be trusted to run it responsibly. But the employees who work there, the people who actually create the value that made you rich in the first place, they might be able to run it better than you ever did. Employee ownership has been successful in lots of companies, Maya added. The workers have a direct stake in the success of the business, so they're motivated to work harder and make better decisions. Richard was quiet for a long time, processing this radical suggestion. Everything in him rebelled against the idea of giving up control of the company he had built from nothing. But he also couldn't ignore the logic of what they were suggesting. Even if I agreed to that, he said finally, where would the money come from? Employees at Blackwood Industries aren't wealthy. They can't afford to buy out a multi-billion-dollar company. Not by themselves, Zoe agreed. But what about outside investors who believe in the employee ownership model? What about Government programs that support worker cooperatives? What about crowdfunding from people who want to stick it to corporate greed? You could start a movement, Maya said, getting excited about the idea. Be the first billionaire to voluntarily give up his company to save jobs instead of just taking a golden parachute and running away. Sarah watched Richard's face carefully as he considered these suggestions. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, weighing the possibilities against his pride and his fear. It would mean admitting that I'm a failure, Richard said quietly. No, Sarah corrected him. It would mean admitting that you made mistakes and taking responsibility for fixing them. That's not failure. That's growth. Richard looked around, the room at the four people who had somehow become the most important voices in his decision. 24 hours ago, he hadn't even known 3 of them existed. Now they were offering him a path forward that he never would have considered on his own. What about the criminal charges? He asked. Even if we saved the company, I could still go to prison for what I did. Then you go to prison, Jake said, simply. But at least you'll go knowing that you did everything you could to make things right for the people you hurt. And we'll be here when you get out, Maya added, surprising herself with the words. She wasn't sure she was ready to have a relationship with this man, but she also couldn't deny that she was impressed by his willingness to face the consequences of his actions. Richard felt tears starting to form in his eyes again. But this time, they weren't tears of despair. For the first time in months, he could see a possible future that didn't end in complete destruction. Okay, he said. Let's do it. Let's try to save the company and give it to the people who actually deserve it. Sarah smiled at him, and for a moment, he caught a glimpse of the young woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. Now that's the man I remember, the one who used to care about more than just making money. What's the first step? Richard asked. The first step, Sarah replied, is you call your lawyer and tell him you want to schedule a press conference for first thing tomorrow morning, and then you start writing the most important speech of your life. 3 months later, Maya stood in the back of the packed auditorium at Seattle Community College, watching her brother Jake accept his diploma. The past few months had been a whirlwind of changes for their family, and seeing Jake finally able to return to school was one of the most rewarding parts of it all. In the audience, she could see Richard sitting next to her mother and Zoe. He looked different now, thinner, older, but somehow more at peace than he had been that night on the bridge. The press conference 3 months ago had been brutal, but it had also been the beginning of something extraordinary. When Richard had stood in front of the cameras and confessed everything, the stolen pension funds, the failed investments, his plan to take his own life, the public reaction had been mixed. Many people were angry and called for him to go to prison immediately. But there were also those who were moved by his honesty and his willingness to give up everything to make things right. The employee buyout of Blackwood Industries had taken 2 months to organize, but it had worked. A combination of employee, investments, government grants for worker cooperatives, and public crowdfunding had raised enough money to purchase Richard's stake in the company and restore the stolen pension funds. Richard had kept nothing for himself except enough money to pay for Sarah's medical treatment and legal fees for his upcoming trial. The new employee-owned Blackwood Industries was thriving under Democratic management. Productivity was up, morale was higher than it had been in years, and they had already landed several major contracts that the old company had lost due to the scandal. The workers were proving that they could run the business better than one man making all the decisions from the top. Richard's criminal trial was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. His lawyers had negotiated a plea deal that would likely result in 18 months in minimum security prison, followed by 5 years of community service. It wasn't a harsh sentence considering the amount of money involved, but Richard had insisted on pleading guilty rather than fighting the charges. He wanted to take full responsibility for his actions. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from the doctor. She had been waiting for Sarah's latest test results, and her hands shook slightly as she opened the message. The experimental treatment that Richard's money had made possible was working. The cancer was in remission, and while there were no guarantees, the doctors were cautiously optimistic about Sarah's long-term prognosis. After the graduation ceremony, the family gathered at a small restaurant to celebrate. It was still awkward sometimes having Richard around, but they were all slowly learning how to be a family. Jake had been the most resistant at first, but he had gradually warmed up to Richard after seeing how hard he was working to make amends. "So what's next?" Richard asked as they sat around the table sharing dessert. "I'm starting nursing school in the fall," Maya announced, "thanks to the scholarship fund you set up for children of Blackwood employees. I'm going to finish my teaching degree," Zoe added. "The new Blackwood Industries is funding education programs for employees and their families. It turns out that when workers own the company, they invest in their own futures." Jake grinned. "And I'm going to law school. Somebody needs to keep an eye on corporate executives who think they can steal from working people." Richard laughed, though there was a hint of nervousness in it. "Should I be worried?" "Only if you're planning to steal any more pension funds," Jake replied, but his tone was friendly rather than hostile. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Richard's hand. "What about you? What are your plans after everything?" Richard was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that a lot. When I get out of prison, I want to start a non-profit organization that helps other companies transition to employee ownership. There are a lot of businesses out there that could benefit from the same model we used at Blackwood." "That sounds perfect," Maya said. "Using your experience to help other people instead of just making yourself richer." "I also want to spend time getting to know my children," Richard added, looking at each of the triplets in turn. "I know I can't make up for the years I lost, but I hope I can be part of your lives going forward in whatever way you're comfortable with." "We'd like that," Zoe said, speaking for all three siblings. They had talked about it extensively and decided that while they couldn't forget the past, they were willing to build a future together. The conversation was interrupted by a young woman approaching their table. She looked nervous, but determined as she walked up to Richard. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Richard Blackwood?" Richard tensed, expecting another angry confrontation. Over the past few months, he had been recognized in public several times, and the encounters weren't always pleasant. "Yes," he said carefully. "I work at Blackwood Industries," the woman continued, "in the accounting department. I just wanted to thank you for what you did, for giving us the company. My daughter is going to college next year because of the profit-sharing program the worker cooperative started. I never thought that would be possible on my salary." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "You don't need to thank me. You and your coworkers are the ones making the company successful. I just got out of your way." The woman smiled and walked away, leaving Richard staring down at his hands. Moments like this had become more common lately, and they never failed to move him. "How does it feel?" Sarah asked softly. "Knowing that losing everything led to something better?" "Strange," Richard admitted. "For so many years I measured my worth by how much money I had, how much power I wielded. Now I have almost nothing, and I'm about to go to prison, but I feel more valuable than I ever did when I was a billionaire." "That's because you're finally using your life to help other people instead of just yourself," Maya observed. "I learned that from you three," Richard said, looking at his children. "That night on the bridge, when you saved a complete stranger. Without expecting anything in return, you showed me what real strength looks like, what real success looks like." Jake raised his water glass. "Here's to second chances, and to the family we never knew we had." They all raised their glasses and clinked them together, a toast to the strange series of events that had brought them together. Richard knew that he still had a long way to go to earn his place in their lives, and that the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in years, he was facing the future with hope instead of fear. Outside the restaurant, the Seattle skyline twinkled in the evening light. Somewhere in that city, Thousands of employees were heading home from jobs that had been saved by a desperate man's decision to give up everything he thought mattered. In a small apartment across town, medical equipment that had seemed impossibly expensive 3 months ago was helping a mother fight for her life. And in a courthouse downtown, legal documents were being prepared for a trial that would finally bring justice for decades of corporate greed. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still challenges ahead, still relationships to rebuild and trust to earn. But it was a beginning, and sometimes that's all any family needs. The chance to start over, to learn from their mistakes, and to build something better together than any of them could have created alone. As they walked out of the restaurant together, Richard found himself thinking about that night on the bridge, when 3 strangers had appeared out of the storm to save his life. He had thought he was losing everything, but in reality, he had been about to find the only things that really mattered: family, forgiveness, and the opportunity to spend the rest of his life making amends for the years he had wasted.